Welcome everyone to our seminar on God and gender. We may have some other folks joining in and that's just fine. I sent you all a couple reflection questions ahead of time just to be thinking on and stewing on. Those questions were, how do you address God when you pray? Do you call God Father or Lord or something else? And what does that mean for how you picture God? And then secondly, imagine opening a prayer to Mother God. How does that feel? Does that work for you? Why or why not? All right, can you all see the slides okay? Great. All right, so here are the main takeaways. And I've numbered these, and they're kind of expansive. We'll just do the best we can covering these topics. And I want to invite, if you do have more that you'd like to talk about afterwards, reach out to me. Y'all received the email, so I'd be happy to talk more personally with where these ideas land for you or other things you want to unpack. Happy to visit over those. Also, you're welcome to use the chat feature in Zoom at any point and just ask your questions. I'll leave a couple spaces as well where you can unmute and ask questions. But feel free if you're struck by something, you want to ask something or jump in and say something, feel free to use the chat for that. So we're just going to walk through these main takeaways. So that first one there, that ideas of gender are socially constructed and very complicated. So I'm going to start with a definition of gender. It refers to any characteristic associated with men or women, girls or boys. And these characteristics can vary widely from society to society, and ideas about gender evolve or change over time. Gender is related to sex, but different. It's different from sex and gender identity. So this is from the World Health Organization, really, really helpful. Gender interacts with, but is different from sex, which refers to the different biological and physiological characteristics of females, males, and intersex persons, such as chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive organs. Gender and sex are related to but different from gender identity. So a third element. Gender identity refers to a person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond to the person's physiology or designated sex at birth. Okay, so I just wanted to give those quick definitions to sort of just provide the landscapes. And the big thing here is that gender is very, very complicated. And I want to give you two practical examples of this. So in the first one is related to the fields of anthropology and sociology, where when they do ethnographic studies, they've recognized that assignments of what is masculine and feminine vary widely across different cultures. In fact, there's a great fun example that's often used in anthropological studies of a couple cultures in South America of these two different people groups, two different cultures that live fairly close to one another, but are different. And in one group, the men make the baskets. And in the other group, the women make the baskets. And the two groups know this about one another, and they will make fun of the other because the other's men are effeminate and are not true men because they don't do or do the women's work, depending on how they see it. And so when anthropologists look at this, their conclusion is that gender roles and gender assignments in culture are arbitrary, that they are socially created. Now we can look at this example and sort of kind of, say, oh, that's kind of silly and sort of shrug. But the takeaway here is that our own assignments of what we call masculine or feminine are just as arbitrary as the assignments of making baskets in these two cultures. And I know that can feel hard to really admit because it feels like they're so sure. We're so sure of what is quote unquote masculine or feminine. But we're really not. That's the big takeaway there. I'll give you a practical example from my own life and one we see shifting today, and that is in parenting. So here's a picture of me with my two boys. This is from like 2009, I think, and when they were very young. At this time, when our boys were really young, I became the primary caregiver, the stay-at-home dad in our family. And my wife was working a job outside the home, so she was making an income to support our household. And I was actually in grad school part-time, very part-time, and then taking care of the kids. And I learned a ton from this experience because we would go to story time at the library and I would be the only guy. There'd be a lot of other women or other caregivers with kids. I'd go to the park and similarly, I'd be the only guy. But there were a couple other guys in our church at the time who were stay-at-home dads also. So we had our own little like stay-at-home dad club. There were sometimes I would get into conversations where people would ask me what I do. What do you do? I'd say, well, I'm a stay-at-home caregiver, a parent. And they look at me a little puzzled and unsure what to make of that. You know, was I being a true man? Was I really being masculine if I wasn't earning an income and supporting our household? That was kind of underneath some of the assumptions there. But here's the interesting thing. My kids now have maintained all of these associations of me as primary caregiver. And so I'll give you just a funny example. If they get sick, if they're sick and not well, or if they need something in the middle of the night, guess whose side of the bed they come to? Mine. They come get dad, because dad's the one that takes care of them when they're sick. Dad's the one who cuddles with them on the couch and makes them soup or figures out what they need to nurture them back to health. I'm the nurturer in their world when they are sick. My wife, Allie, is a total nurturer too. So I don't know. We just kind of break the assumptions of gender stereotypes there, I guess. But dad, in their minds, you know, dad's the one that does the shopping. Dad's the one that drives places. Dad's the one that does the meal planning, preparing, cooking. I do a lot of that still. I enjoy that stuff. And it kind of works given how our lives are set up. So these are changing. You know, I know that a lot of men and women are negotiating these roles. Like, what does it mean? Who is earning the income? Who's doing the chores? And what is masculine? What is feminine? Those are constantly shifting now in our culture. Okay, so gender. Given those examples, and given a lot else we know, gender is not binary. We love to sort people. It's just a thing that humans do. We sort people in all kinds of ways. But when it comes to gender, it's just not very helpful to sort people into either a masculine category or a feminine category. Every person is incredibly, incredibly complex, infinitely complex, in fact. And so our fixed ideas of gender are never going to apply 100% to any person. Gender is more of a spectrum, we might say, or even more complicated than that. Sex, by the way, is also not binary. It's estimated that 1.7% of all people are born intersex. And intersex is an umbrella term, which means there's a wide range of natural variations that affect the human body. So the genitals, gonads, hormones, chromosomes, or reproductive organs. Sometimes the characteristics of intersex people are visible at birth. Sometimes they become visible at puberty. Sometimes they are never visible physically. And that's from amnesty.org is where I'm getting these figures, the 1.7%. But just to give you a sense, like that's not an insignificant number. Like that's 2,500 people within Johnson County, Iowa, are intersex people. So it's a very significant people who are not a boy or a girl, but somehow both or neither, or, you know, it's complicated. The Bible also does not think sex and gender are binary. And I want to give you an example from Genesis, the creation story, in which sex and gender are not binary. So here it is, the scripture. God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So on the surface, this can sound like God is creating two different sexes, right? There's male and there's female. And that masculine and feminine then would be mapped onto those sexes. But that's not what's happening. So in Genesis 1, what we see God do is make a number of things. God creates... Hi, Jen. God creates land and sea. God creates night and day, and then all the species. But the problem there is that we get a lot of things in between that don't fall into those categories, like a swamp. Is a swamp land or sea? Well, it's kind of in the middle. Or a bog. Or how about a shoreline? What about dawn and dusk that are neither night nor day, right? There's this mixing. Or if you go to Iceland, where the sun basically never sets in June, or it sets sort of, but there's never really darkness in Iceland in June. I've been there. In species, we see the species are made in their multitudes, but sometimes it's very, very difficult to tell one species apart from another. We assign different species different names, but sometimes those species, we learn later on, can actually produce offspring together. So it's extremely complicated. And so what we learn from Genesis 1 is the pattern that God makes the land and the sea and everything in between. God makes the night and the day and everything in between. God makes male and female and everything in between. It is a spectrum. It's complicated. It's creation in all of its glory. So it's not a binary pattern. All right, so that's point number one. Yay, ideas of gender are socially constructed and very complicated. Deep breath, move around, do whatever you need. We're going on to number two. Now I'm gonna check the time. Hey, we're doing great. All right, number two, God has no gender. God is all genders. Those might sound contradictory. They kind of are. Let's have fun. Well, first, we are going to take a minute to hear from our Velociraptor, who asks a profound question. Yes, Velociraptor, you have a question. Yes, your question is, what is God? What is God? All right, now we're going to dive deep into the philosophy for a minute. If this just does not float your boat, don't worry about it. We're not going to spend a long time here. But I want to do this because it shows just how deep this goes, okay, into the nature of God. This can sound like a pretty simple question. What is God? Well, God is God. The problem is that when we talk about God, God is outside of creation. God is not a creature. God's not one of us. God's not part of the universe. God is outside of creation. Everything we experience, however, is within creation. We are part of creation. All of our ideas that we come up with are part of creation. And all of our language is part of creation. So when philosophers and theologians try to answer the question, what is God? They quickly realize that everything we say about God falls short, because we are using our own language and our own ideas from within creation, but God is outside of it. We might say that God is bigger than that, right? God is so much bigger than what humans could actually comprehend or imagine. That's a kind of a common way to say it, a shorthand way to say it, if you will. One of the prophets in the Bible says that God's thoughts are not our thoughts. God's ways are not our ways. And so even while the prophet is wrestling with how can I name what God is saying and speaking, the prophet knows, actually, at the end of the day, God is way beyond and way beyond and above what we could possibly imagine or understand. Another way to think about this is that, here we go. So this is the therefore. Gender, then when we think about God, gender is within creation. So God cannot have gender because God transcends creation and gender only exists within creation. It's our idea of how we make meaning of the world. So to apply it to God, who transcends, is outside of creation, doesn't really make any sense. If I asked you, what is the color of the number 4? What's the color of the number 4? You would know that that question doesn't really make sense, right? Because the property of color cannot correspond to an abstract number. It doesn't make any sense. This is the same with God and gender. The property of gender doesn't really make sense to apply to a God who transcends or is outside or above and beyond our limited creation. Okay, now I'm going to contradict everything I just said because God relates to us within creation, right? So we experience God as coming into our world. God is actively participating in our world somehow. And when we experience God acting or speaking or responding to us, it's as if God is like a person. God relates to us personably, and we have a relationship with God, right? And so we will naturally apply our gendered associations to God, all of our genders. We will think of as applying to God. God acts in a certain way, God speaks in a certain way, and we might assign that way masculine or feminine or somewhere in between or mixing. But that's what we'll do because it's within our creation, it's within our experience. Okay, there's a big problem though, when we think about this, and that is, what about Jesus? Okay, because in Christian theology, Jesus is said to be the full embodiment, the full incarnation of who and what God is like. And Jesus was a man. He was born as a baby boy. It's a boy. He grows up in the first century. He is a Jewish rabbi, a man. Okay, so quick things about Jesus, and the word I'm going to use is the incarnation. Incarnation is the fancy theological word to talk about God coming into our world as a human being, as Jesus. That's the incarnation. When we think about Jesus, the Christian tradition teaches that Jesus is both divine and human, and that the two are one. In Jesus, the divine and human become one. There is a profound union that happens in the person of Jesus. So that Jesus is somehow both 100% divine and 100% human. The question then that we can ask is, could the incarnation have happened with a woman? Could God have become a woman? And another way to frame the question is, could the 100% divine nature and the 100% human nature have existed in a woman's body? And the answer is yes, absolutely. There is nothing essentially about maleness, about being a man, that God had to occupy to accomplish what we see in front of us on the screen. This formula and this kind of mysterious union of divine and human could just as effectively or satisfyingly be accomplished in the body of a woman as much as it could have been in the body of a man. If we don't say that, then we're going to have to conclude that men are special or specialer than women. But I'm not willing to conclude that. And I don't think that the Bible is willing to conclude that either. And I don't think when we look at the sum of Christian theology and tradition, I don't think that we're going to conclude that either. To be sure, there are traditions that teach that within Christianity. Okay, so I'm presenting you my own understanding, certainly sanctuary's understanding. But there we go. There is certainly a debate about that. All right, so just to repeat, Jesus was a man, he was male, but that does not mean that God is male or masculine. And the reason we can't conclude that is going back to the idea that God transcends creation. So God becomes a human being in the person of Jesus, becomes a man, but we can't then make ultimate conclusions about God as masculine or that God is a man. We do this with other things as well. We take, for example, that Jesus spoke Aramaic. That was the language that Jesus spoke. We don't take that fact and make conclusions then about the language that God speaks. We know that we would say God speaks in every and all languages, right? That God somehow is able to transcend the limited first century experience that Jesus had. Jesus did not know English. Somehow when I pray to Jesus, however, today, he understands me. It's amazing, right? So it transcends it. So when we look at the human figure of Jesus, we don't have to make conclusions about that limit God's essence from the things that we know to be true about Jesus, the person. And by the way, we'll look at this in a minute, but Jesus transcends a lot of masculine ideas culturally anyway. Jesus says things and does things that are very feminine, and we'll look at those again in a minute. Okay, stretch break. Mainly for me, I don't know. You can get up and move if you want. I'm just going to do a couple things real quick as I'm doing this. Hang on. I'm going to stop share. All right, feel free to put in the chat again. If you have any questions, you're welcome to. Doing good on time. All right, and I'll have an open Q&A at the end too. So, all right, Katie, I have so many questions, I don't know where to start. I share that sentiment daily. All right. All right. Hey, we made it through the dense stuff, and I'm now going to enter more of the practical stuff. So, hooray, well done. The third point, if you will, is images of God, the images of God, okay? And so we're going to think about the Bible now. And the Bible includes the full range of masculine and feminine images for God. And so I want to ask the question, what are some masculine images, stories, or representations of God in the Bible? Think about that for a moment. If you're with other people, feel free to talk about it. What are some masculine images, stories, or representations of God in the Bible?
Well, Jesus refers to God as my Father.
Good. Yeah, Father. Yeah, thanks, Jackie. Anyone else want to chime in? Or feel free to use the chat as well.
I don't know if this is specific to a version of the Bible, a translation. I feel like the one I grew up with often used he as a reference pronoun. I'm not sure if that's true across, but the one I grew up with, I'm pretty sure did.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. Yeah, Katie, great point. That is actually in the original languages. So the original language is of ancient Greek for the New Testament, ancient Hebrew, and there's a little bit of Aramaic there too in Daniel. All of those languages designate God with masculine pronouns. Would use he, him, whenever talking about the divine figure of God or the Lord.
I'm thinking about different parables. For example, like the prodigal son's parent was a father.
Yeah. Yep. Thanks, Kevo. Yeah. Lots of parables. Yeah. Let's see here. Here, I just made a quick list of some of the ways that people sort of designate ideas or titles to God that to me sort of land in that more masculine side of the spectrum. King, certainly, the lawgiver, the warrior God, God who strikes people down. There's certainly lots of stories where God's a warrior coming into battle. God is a judge, judging human beings. Sometimes creator, depending what you're creating. If you're making baskets, maybe that's not so masculine. I don't know. And then provider, similarly, maybe there's a question there. What about feminine? What are some feminine images, stories, or representations of God in the Bible? What do you think? And I'm going to spend a lot more time on this one because this is maybe where we need a little more emphasis.
I think my favorite is as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. Yeah, that's a lovely image. Woman with the lost coin from Katie. Thank you, Katie. Yep. And then comforter, Ashley said. Yeah, good. I'm going to share just a few others. So in the Old Testament, there are a couple times where God is referred to as a mother. And there's this idea that God is giving birth to the people of God. So you see that a couple times mentioned in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, specifically in Numbers and then Deuteronomy. God is giving birth to God's people who are coming out of Egypt and coming into their own land. We have a mother who comforts. That's an image that Isaiah uses in Isaiah 66. So there you go, Ashley, the comforter. Wisdom and Sophia. So wisdom or Sophia, that's the same thing, interchangeable. But in Proverbs 8, there's a longer section about this. And I want to read this. This is great stuff. So this is from Proverbs 8. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago, I was set up at the first before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. And now, my children, listen to me. Happy are those who keep my ways. Hear instruction and be wise, and do not neglect it. So what Proverbs 8 is doing is it's a long poem that's narrating wisdom as a person, as Sophia, a woman. And it's this very feminine imagery of wisdom and of God. And in Christian theology, Christians were quick to sort of assign or interpret that scripture as applying to Jesus. So that Jesus is this figure of wisdom, and Jesus embodies wisdom in his own body, takes on this woman, Sophia, this wise figure. He becomes that. So it's really quite lovely. God is a midwife in Psalm 22. And God is a compassionate one in Hosea 11. Jesus' teachings. So Becky, well done, mother hen there. God is like a mother hen, a chicken. but a mother hen looking after the little ones. We have a few parables there. So the woman mixing yeast in Luke 13, Jesus describes God as a woman mixing yeast. The woman finding the lost coin. And then you must be born again. This is one of my favorites. It is amazing how many traditions, especially in American sort of evangelical traditions, how much this gets emphasized. You must be born again, and you need to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. And that's how you're born again, and you will be saved. That's a lot of how evangelical traditions will emphasize coming into faith with Jesus. There can be lots of good things about that. So I'm not trying to throw shade on that. But my point today is that being born again, the image is incredibly feminine. You are born of God. So God in that analogy is a woman giving birth. You're entering into God, being born of, through, with God. So God is a woman who gives birth to you, and that's how you receive new life in Jesus. Somehow that part of the equation gets lost. That when I hear, some of the evangelical traditions that will emphasize that, it never occurs to them that what a feminine, profoundly feminine image that is, to be born of God. That God's our mother and nurses us into new life in Jesus. All right. One slide here on Jesus's actions himself. So I mentioned this earlier, but to me, when I read through the gospel stories, Jesus often embodies what we might think of as more feminine characteristics. Again, these are all socially constructed and assigned. So even saying the words sometimes don't work. And I just want to acknowledge that. But using our dominant culturally constructed lenses, which might be my own white dominant US culture lens, this is what I see in Jesus. He demonstrates an intimacy and vulnerability that may not be quite as common with masculine people or men in our culture. Again, dominant white culture. Crying and weeping similarly in compassion. Thank you, Kevo. Yes, on the comment there about men and birth. Thank you. Just catch up on the comments. All right. Okay, so we're on our last main takeaway, and that is feminine images of God have been used throughout Christian history. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through this, and then we'll kind of open up for other questions and any conversation we want to have. So here are a couple quotes. These are from early church folks, as you can see from the dates there, 200 in the Common Era. Common Era is the new designation. Instead of AD, we just say CE. In his ineffable essence, he is Father. In his compassion to us, he became Mother. The Father, by loving, becomes feminine. And another one from the same person, Clement of Alexandria. The word Christ is everything to his little ones, both Father and Mother. So very early on in Christian tradition, as folks are making meaning of the Jesus story, they are assigning both masculine and feminine, or a mix of that whole spectrum. They're assigning all kinds of meaning to God and to Jesus. Another one from St. Ambrose early on. Gender is attributed to human nature, but never to the Godhead. Hello. That's some theology right there. So he's saying, again, what I was kind of saying early on, that because God is outside of creation, we can't attribute gender to God. And then Chrysostom, thou art my father, thou art my mother, thou my brother, thou art friend, thou art servant, thou art housekeeper, thou art the all, and the all is in thee, thou art being, and there is nothing that is except thou. Just his confession, his prayer. but attributing all of these identities to God, including mother. A couple in the sort of middle period there, Julian of Norwich, sort of a famous mystic. She would refer to Christ as our heavenly mother frequently. And I didn't do anything with this, but we could do a lot too with devotion to Mary and the whole tradition around Mary that has developed. That's kind of a whole other seminar, if you will. So maybe that'll be part 2, I don't know. But we could do a lot of work with that. And even as people pray to Mary, Mary sort of transcends the human divine thing. And she sort of takes on some divine characteristics as well. And certainly other saints do as well in some traditions. So, but anyway, that's another thing. Anselm, who's a very, very a big figure within church philosophy and theology, he called Saint Paul his mother, and also Jesus. And I'm going to read this to you. This is a famous passage from Saint Anselm, and so he's talking to Paul in the first half of this prayer, and then he switches to Jesus. He says, "O Saint Paul, where is he that was called the nurse of the faithful, caressing his sons? Who is that affectionate mother who declares everywhere that she is in labor for her sons?" So again, he's assigning all of these identities to Paul. "Sweet nurse, sweet mother, Paul, who are the sons you are in labor with and nurse, but those whom by teaching the faith of Christ you bear and instruct." And then he switches to Jesus. "And you, Jesus, are you not also a mother? Are you not the mother who, like a hen, gathers her chickens under her wings? Truly, Lord, you are a mother. For both they who are in labor and they who are brought forth are accepted by you." I was kind of floored when I read this because I was used to like philosophy and theology classes of Anselm, like hard-hitting, really deep theology and philosophy. And then you get this lovely prayer where, he's talking to Paul, his affectionate mother who's laboring and caressing the faithful. Lovely. There are tons of contemporary examples, and I'm just going to give one because time's short, and that is from Christina Cleveland. This is a book that was just published this month, God is a Black Woman. Okay, provocative title. And the reason she's doing this is because she's simply trying to unpack and challenge other ideas about God. So by saying God is a Black woman, you immediately kind of have a whoa moment. And then why is it challenging? What is it we assume otherwise about God that would make that image different or challenging or wherever that falls for us, right? And she would say she's very much trying to challenge the sort of common white male God idea. And even when Christians might say, we don't think God is white or male, the way that Christians often use language or talk about God can default into some of those common conceptions. And so this is one example, again, of many, and you could do some research. If you want more resources, I'd be happy to share some more. Okay, so here again are the main takeaways. Ideas of gender are socially constructed and very complicated. God has no gender. God is all genders. Hooray. The Bible includes a full range of masculine and feminine images for God, and feminine images of God have been used throughout Christian history. So what works for you? What images of God help you connect to God? How would it feel to call God mother in prayer or use feminine images and pronouns for God? Well, I think I want to just then wrap it up. I want to do one final thing. I want to share a prayer with you to close. But again, I'll just invite further conversation. If you want to talk further about anything that came up, happy to do so. Yeah, so this is a prayer from let me make sure I got my source right. It's from the Methodist Book of Worship. Loving God, you who have given us birth, you who have provided for us a home in creation, you who hold us in your lap and walk with us all our days, as a loving mother tends her children, so you love and tend us, and we thank you. We praise you. We worship you. May your spirit guide our worship and your love guide our lives. Amen. All right, that concludes our seminar.